there is a large loop, large-scale loop with exact pitch classes. But then what happens with those is those are threaded against these 8 large aggregate chords that I have at the beginning. Right? So the order of the pitch classes is determined separately from the pitches that those will be filling in. And then what happens is after all that was done, you go back to the rhythm, and it was a paint job, literally time traversing the entire score, just look for attacks in the order that they occur, and paint. So the whole thing is as horizontal as you can possibly imagine. Like, the whole piece is just completely horizontally conceived. And by the way that I set up the order of the pitch classes, I made sure that when things align and we actually get sonorities, that they would be sonorities that were interesting to me, which will say a bunch of major segments. So the sonorities are incidental, kind of the same way that the attacks and things that come out of the separated flute and violin writing are incidental to those techniques as well. And then there's some things that happen, like some more composerly, maybe, sort of things in the way that I've set up the score. Like you'll notice there are these places all the time where everybody stops playing tuplets that are separate, and all of a sudden we're in unified rhythm, right, from 1 measure or 2 measures. And what those are places where I went through and said, okay, I need a type of cadential sort of thing to happen here. And so always from the rhythm of the piano that already existed, I would shine my flashlight on that rhythm and use it to cover up the rhythms of the other parts. So in other words, the piano rhythm would just dominate whatever else was there. The material that was in the flute and violin would be erased, and everybody would share in the piano's rhythms, although they keep their own pitches. And so those are strategically placed in the middles of sections and not at the end of sections. Sections are mostly silent and delimited, except where they're not, or I use a silence to suggest that something's over, but then refuse to do it. So you've got those 2 kind of large-scale things working, which is points of rhythmic unison, which make you feel like you've arrived somewhere, at least you don't have to think about 3 or 4 or 5 rhythms at one time, are always section internal. So they don't mark what you would think that they would mark. They don't mark the ends of things, and they don't mark the beginnings of things. But then the silences largely do. That's for me as projection. Deletion, there are all these full measure rests everywhere, and those 2 are structuring devices that were put in at the very end, right? So there's composed material underneath all of those sections. And then it's like a process of deciding what I want to get rid of. So I know I'm not inserting a cheap rest, I'm getting rid of something that was important to me earlier, but now I'm deciding what to cut out with my X-Acto knife. And binding we talked about earlier, parameter binding. Okay, so there's some technical stuff, and you got the kind of poetic stuff at the beginning. So we have just enough time for questions.
What kind of technology do you use when you work with these lists of stuff and things?
Right. So one of the advantages of having been an engineer for 10 years is that I've written my own. So you can, where this is going to cut to the chase is you can go to Google Code and download all the software that I use myself. It's all available on the public internet. People are not using it as a supplement to or replacement for open music in many cases. So Python is one of the many programming languages that are out there right now. The ones that you've heard of are PHP and Ruby, maybe C++. MIT is a Python shop, for example, which is nice. So long time ago when I referred to making a book of 1,000 chords, I was doing that in C and C++, and then writing out MIDI files, and then reading those MIDI files into Finale so that I could visualize notation. I'm all about the notation, right? I just have to see in order to be able to hear. It's really weird, right? Like we can start with a sound image, but then it needs to go to some type of notation so I can tweak it. That's not a really good way to go, as I'm sure everybody in this room knows, because MIDI is this flat representation of stop-start points, and there's no nesting, right? So if you're a guy who's interested in a bunch of tuplets, why would you use a non-nested? Okay, so then picked that out of bed and started programming in Mathematica because I was doing a bunch of statistical analysis, and that was really cool. Mathematica is based on Lisp, the same way that common music is, which of course is what all the kind of French and American composers that do programming tend to use, right? So like a Lisp-derived language. But here's the thing about working in Lisp. It's awesome, it's structural, but there aren't many Lisp programmers. So if you're looking to be able to borrow other people's technology, Lisp is not a good choice, even though our entire discipline has been focused on it since kind of the David Cope days. And I don't know what to say about that. I go give talks about this stuff all the time. I talk about this at your camp, actually. It's like, well, I know that this is how this has grown up, but here's the thing. If you use a language like Python or Java or C, there are millions of people solving problems in that language that you can just pick up for free. So I settled on Python to answer your question, and I have a lot of code in Python that lets me do things like rotate things, map out things, and it's not just for manipulating lists of numbers. This stuff has a backend that goes to Lily Pond, which is a text-only notation package that generates this source, a Lily-Pond source, not Sibelius or Canali, which I've used in more than 10 years. And so what happens is the code that I'm working with that models the piece, and there is code that will model the entire thing at the end, knows how to format itself as Lily-Pond code and then show a PDF. So I'm kind of working with the computer and do some things, and then I say, show me the notation that you're equal to, and it goes and it pops up a PDF, and I think, oh, the attack points are right here, I need to fix the pitches, the points bad. And I go back and redo something and do it again and again. So the answer is, I work in Python to model all parts of the score. The name of the package is abjad, which is the Arabic word for a certain type of number sorcery. And that package is available on Google Code, you can download it, and we've got a couple hundred downloads from most of the countries now.
Cool.
What else?
Could you talk a little bit about the relationship between your compositional techniques and the programmatic aspects of this particular composition, excuse me?
Yeah, so the things that I chose to put on this sentence, so they need to just kind of curse words to do our presentation. These things, like when I say and some transforms, well, what the hell does that mean? These things are all actually implemented inside of abjad. Right, so when I talk about building 17-layer rhythmic trough, it helps have a formalization system to do that because I work with permutation, recombination, all these things. So imagine that there are seeds that generate each of these 17 voices, but then what I'll do is just work out dozens or hundreds, actually, of different versions of each of those voices using the tools that I built for myself, and pick the ones that are best by listening to them or reading them or imagining what they're going to do when I give them to a pianist. Right? And then do that for the second voice, the third voice. So this process of building this really enormous rhythmic structure, right, that exists over all 15 minutes of the piece doesn't take 3 months, it takes 2 weeks. Right? And the goal is not to, I'm going to be clear, I never use the word algorithmic on anything that I put up there. Because for me, and this is not true for I would say most people, but it's kind of a language fetish that I have, algorithmic too easily means wind it up and let it go. And there are composers working in a wind it up and let it go aesthetic and producing interesting results. It's fine, but that scares me. To me, it still matters that I have my hands all over stuff and I'm making decisions everywhere and generating material. I like lots, I don't like little, these are all personal preferences. So when I throw a computer in the middle of that process, what I'm using it to do is to not do stuff for me easily, but to give me lots of options. You go shopping on all of these things and then pick the stuff that is the most fit for what I'm imagining. So the names up here, these are function names or module names that help you do stuff. And so when you see these whole measure rests, they're quite easy to see in the score. Those are all picked at one time, right? Like what I'll do is pick a pattern that will choose from the 234 measures in the piece and delete 19 of them in different configurations and go through and look at several dozen of those until I get the one that's optimal and pick it. And that way I'm able to make decisions that cover 15 minutes swath of time at once. Does that answer the question?
Yeah.
Okay.
What's the next step that you have in mind right now? Where are you going to go? I mean, this is from 2008?
Yeah.
What's going on in 2010?
Yeah, so I'm just now finishing up, I just finished up a percussion trio called Aracılık, which is a Turkish word that talks about what happens when you become a vehicle of mediation through things. And I like a bunch of extra musical stuff. I'm just shameless. Like, I think that music is most interesting when it's not about music. My own and others, actually. And so on that piece, I worked with a really good friend who's a geneticist. She works in women's fertility issues and is really smart and amazing at everything. She's awesome. We've known each other for a long time. We studied literature together in Texas. And when she went to Cambridge to work on turning her dissertation into a saliva or urine-based test that will be 96% accurate to see if women are fertile or not, which if that turns out to work, which it looks like it's going to, will change the world. Can you imagine the amount of time and emotional energy that women and their partners put into figuring out whether they can have children or not? This was a very emotionally powerful place, and so we would talk all the time. She was in Cambridge, England, cheap phone calls, and cheap phone cards, and we'd call back and forth. And we developed this emotional, technical, scientific, musical sort of discussion. And so the name, my collaborator is Turkish, she's from Ankara. And so the idea of this percussion music is it's all about things as they move through glass. The scientific knowledge in all of its forms from the very beginning has been mediated by glass once we get to the modern period. from the first microscopic slides, the lenses, the transference mechanisms inside of conventional microscopes, and now, of course, just scanning electron microscopy. Big sets of data that go through languages like Python that real scientists use to do analysis with. We'll make stuff like this, and then onto the computer screens that we use to read stuff and chat on this that we have up there when we do it. We counted something like 42 different pieces of glass that a scientific piece of information might pass through in order for it to make sense to people and do something like tell you whether you can have children or not. So all those ideas get put into a bag, and this trio that is a disassemblable trio. You can play it together, or you can unhinge the parts, and they kind of stack and kind of don't stack on top of those inserts and things that you put in, and you can play them all as solos. And I started doing this thing where, you know how they make sherry in NEC, where they have a cask of something and it's really good, and so they grab some of it and use it to inoculate the next batch of sherry. You know, this is how they do this sort of stuff. It's one of the ways of preserving taste over generations, different types of custom alcohol. Started doing this in pieces, and so snipping bits of the rhythmic material, it's all untuned percussion, so mostly wood timbres in this piece, stored by glass. And I'm snipping those now for a septet for ice that's amplified instruments, strings, harp, guitar, piano, that goes back to a totally different way of looking at things and is written on infatuation. So those are current projects. For the code stuff, yeah, so if you make an open source system that other people might want to use, right, it's all copylefted, right, so you can do, any of you in this room can do anything you want with it, so long as you don't try to make money with it. You're free to change it, you're free to put it into something that you sell, but you can't make money directly with the code itself. And so if you decide to do this, don't do this in the grad school the next year, because one of the things that I found is that I'm very busy across the river. They keep us highly entertained, lots of musicology and music theory classes, and they're awesome. But I'm busy all the time, and there's a growing user base for the code. Like there's lists, people mail in. Every once in a while, some composer in Brazil sends me a complete score they've written with my code, and it's beautiful. It's just like nothing I would even consider. You know, there's like these people doing. So that's very exciting. And what I'm going to try to do is get through my generals, which happen in May, and then after that, I'm going to take a bunch of time to make the code work in more generalized ways for people who don't want to think like I do, and want to do their own thing. Thanks for the question. There's no recording because all the percussionists are writing the percussion piece right now. We can do the email address thing though, I'll send it to you. And the percussionists they didn't know that they were getting a trio. They had all asked for pieces at some point, and I thought, okay, at some point I'm going to write a bunch of percussion music, and so I sat down to do it, and then wrote the pieces simultaneously in wall, so empty wall space, and then sent them the pieces and said, oh, and they're one's in Basel, one's in Freiburg, and one's in Newark. And said, by the way, this is part of a much larger thing. Here's a copy of the full score. Why don't you guys decide if you want to figure out a way to do it from here? So they're busy doing that. It's kind of a surprise gift.
So anybody have any more questions?
Thanks for giving me the chance to come and
of course,
it's really worth doing. So appreciate it.